I found them wedged between old bank statements in Derek's desk drawer, papers I'd never seen before with my signature forged so perfectly it looked real. Divorce papers, already signed by my husband of 12 years. But it was the date that made my blood run cold. 3 months before he even met his secretary, 6 months before I discovered their affair, and exactly 1 week after I'd been diagnosed with a rare genetic condition that would make me very, very wealthy. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Elena Rodriguez, and until 6 months ago, I thought I had the most boring life imaginable. Married to Derek Wilson for 12 years, living in a modest suburban house in Portland, working as a medical research coordinator at the local university. Nothing exciting ever happened to me, or so everyone believed. The morning I found those papers started like any other Tuesday. Derek had left early for another one of his important client meetings that seemed to happen more and more frequently. I was looking for our tax documents when I pulled open the bottom drawer of his antique desk, the one he always kept locked. The key had fallen behind the desk months ago, and Derek never bothered to look for it, claiming there was nothing important in there anyway. That's when I saw them. Official divorce documents from Hoffman, Martinez Associates? A law firm I'd never heard of? My hands shook as I read through the pages. Everything was filled out completely. Derek's signature was there in his familiar scrawl, and there, at the bottom, was what appeared to be my signature, though I had absolutely no memory of ever signing these papers. But it was the filing date that stopped my heart, March 15th. I stared at that date, running the timeline through my head. March 15th was 3 months before Derek hired Emma as his new secretary. It was 6 months before I walked in on them in his office after hours. It was exactly 1 week after I received the phone call that changed everything. The phone call? Dr. Morrison from the genetics lab at Johns Hopkins had been so excited when he called. The rare genetic marker they'd found in my blood work during a routine study participation had made me incredibly valuable to pharmaceutical companies. Not valuable as in a few $1,000s valuable, valuable as in generational wealth valuable, valuable as in never having to work again valuable. I had participated in the study on a whim, needing the extra $200 they offered for a simple blood draw. The researchers were looking for specific genetic markers related to drug metabolism, and apparently, I had won the genetic lottery. My unique DNA sequence could help develop medications for millions of people with similar markers. The pharmaceutical companies were willing to pay handsomely for continued access to my blood samples, my tissue samples, and my participation in their research. $25 million over 10 years. That's what the contract outlined. $2.5 million annually, just for being me, just for having the DNA I was born with. I had signed the contract on March 8th, barely able to believe my luck. The first payment was scheduled to arrive in my personal account on April 1st. I had rushed home to tell Derek the incredible news. We could pay off the house, travel, maybe even start the family we'd been putting off for financial reasons. But Derek's reaction was strange. Instead of excitement, he seemed almost angry. He questioned every detail, demanded to see the contract, asked if I was sure it was legitimate. Then he insisted we celebrate privately, that we shouldn't tell anyone about the windfall until we were certain it was real. Now, staring at divorce papers dated exactly 1 week after that celebration, I understood his reaction differently. I photographed every page with my phone, my hands trembling as I tried to keep the camera steady. The papers were thorough, professionally prepared. They outlined a division of assets that would leave Derek with almost everything we'd accumulated during our marriage. The house, his business, our savings accounts, even my car would go to him. According to these documents, I would walk away with only my personal belongings and whatever I had in my individual accounts. Individual accounts that, as of March 8th, would soon contain $25 million. Derek had forged my signature on documents that would legally separate our finances before I received the most significant financial opportunity of my lifetime. He had planned to divorce me and keep me from any claim to his assets while ensuring he had no legal obligation to share in mine.
The affair with Emma wasn't the cause of our marriage falling apart. It was just the method he'd chosen to make me want to leave willingly. I carefully placed the papers back exactly as I'd found them and locked the drawer. My mind was racing, but I forced myself to go through the motions of a normal day. I made coffee, checked emails, reviewed research protocols for the study I was coordinating, but underneath the routine, I was calculating. Derek had no idea I'd found the papers. He thought he was still in control of his timeline, still managing his plan perfectly. He would continue his affair with Emma, probably escalating it until I discovered them, or he felt confident enough to ask for a divorce. Then he would present me with papers to sign, papers that looked identical to the ones already prepared with my forged signature. I would sign them willingly, thinking I was escaping a cheating husband, never knowing he'd already stolen my financial future. But Derek made several crucial errors in his planning. First, he underestimated my intelligence. Just because I worked in medical research coordination instead of high finance didn't mean I couldn't understand legal documents or recognize financial manipulation. Second, he assumed I would never find the papers. His arrogance about his locked drawer made him careless about hiding evidence. And third, and most importantly, he had no idea what my real job actually involved. You see, medical research coordination was indeed my official title at the university. I did coordinate studies, manage databases, and ensure ethical compliance with research protocols. But that was only part of what I did. The university's medical research department had contracts with several government agencies, including the FBI's Forensic Science Division. Part of my job involved coordinating research that helped solve crimes, identify suspects, and build legal cases through her expertise in genetic evidence and financial fraud. That evening, Derek came home with flowers and Thai takeout from my favorite restaurant. He was unusually affectionate, asking about my day, complimenting my hair, suggesting we plan a weekend getaway.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The guilty husband playbook, right down to the over-the-top gestures. "How was your day, beautiful?" he asked, kissing my forehead as he set the food on our kitchen counter. "Oh, the usual," I replied, accepting his kiss while thinking about the forged signature I'd discovered. Coordinated a few research protocols, reviewed some participant files, nothing too exciting. Derek relaxed visibly at my mundane response. "Well, you work too hard. You should consider taking some time off, maybe focusing on other things." He paused, as if the thought had just occurred to him. "Actually, have you given any more thought to that genetic study payout? When is that supposed to start?" There it was. He was still fishing for information about the timeline, making sure his divorce plan aligned with my financial windfall. I smiled sweetly, playing the role he expected. "Oh, that? I'm starting to think it might not be legitimate after all. I haven't heard anything since I signed the contract, and they haven't sent any confirmation about payment schedules. It's probably too good to be true." Derek's shoulders relaxed even further. Perfect. Let him think the money might not materialize. It would make him less careful, more confident in his timeline. "Well, these things often are scams," he said, opening containers of pad thai. "Probably for the best. We don't need that kind of complication in our lives." Complication. That's what $25 million represented to him. A complication that might interfere with his plans to steal my future. After dinner, Derek settled into his office to catch up on some work. Through the thin walls, I could hear him on the phone with someone, his voice low and intimate. Emma, most likely, updating him on his progress. I used the time to begin my own work. I photographed every financial document I could find, every bank statement, every business record Derek kept in his files. I documented our assets, our debts, our income streams. I researched Hoffman, Martinez Associates, and discovered they specialized in high-asset divorces and had a reputation for aggressive tactics that sometimes crossed ethical lines. Most importantly, I began building a timeline of Derek's dissection. When had he first contacted the law firm? How long had he been planning this betrayal? Were there other documents I hadn't found yet? I also called the pharmaceutical company's legal department and requested copies of all documentation related to my contract. I wanted everything in my personal possession,
away from Derek's potential interference. They were happy to accommodate, praising my excellent organizational skills and professional thoroughness, if they only knew how professional I was about to become. Over the following weeks, I maintained my routine while secretly building my case. Derek became increasingly bold with his affair, staying out later, taking longer business trips with Emma, becoming more careless about covering his tracks. He was confident in his plan, secure in his belief that I was oblivious to both his infidelity and his financial schemes. The first payment from the pharmaceutical company arrived on schedule, April 1st. $2.5 million appeared in my personal account, the one Derek had always dismissed as Elena's little savings account. I transferred the money immediately to a new account at a different bank, one Derek had never heard of. I also hired my own attorney, Sarah Chen from Martinez Associates, a firm with an excellent reputation for protecting clients from financial fraud. Sarah was fascinated by my case. "This is incredibly sophisticated financial manipulation," she told me during our first meeting. "Your husband essentially planned to rob you of millions of dollars through forged legal documents. The criminal implications are staggering." "What are my options?" I asked. "Well, you could confront him now, expose the forgery, and file for divorce on your terms. You'd keep your money and probably get a significant portion of his assets as well. Or," Sarah smiled, and I could see why she had such a fierce reputation, "or we can let him think his plan is working while we build a case that will destroy him completely. Financial fraud, forgery, attempted theft of this magnitude, we're talking about serious criminal charges in addition to the divorce proceedings." I thought about Derek's smug confidence, his careful manipulation, his assumption that I was too naive to protect myself. How long would we need to build the case? "Give me 3 months to document everything properly. Can you maintain the facade that long?" I smiled back at her. "Sarah, I've been maintaining a facade for 12 years of marriage. 3 more months will be easy." And it was easy. Derek continued his affair with Emma, becoming more brazen by the day. He started talking about needing space and growing apart during our conversations. He began criticizing things about me that had never bothered him before: my work, my appearance, my personality. He was building his justification for divorce, creating a narrative that would make his request seem reasonable. Meanwhile, I documented everything: every late night, every suspicious phone call, every unexplained expense. Sarah's team of investigators traced Derek's communications with the law firm, uncovered multiple meetings I'd never known about, and discovered that he'd been planning this scheme for over 8 months. We also discovered that Emma was more than just his affair partner. She was a crucial part of his plan. Emma had experience in financial fraud from a previous job, and she'd been helping Derek navigate the legal complexities of his scheme. They weren't just lovers, they were criminal partners. The pharmaceutical company's second payment arrived in May, another $2.5 million. I transferred it to my secure account, now holding $5 million that Derek had no idea existed. According to his forged documents, this money would legally be his after our divorce.
According to reality, he would never see a penny of it. By June, Derek was ready to make his move. He came home one evening with an expression I'd never seen before: determined, almost cold. Emma wasn't with him, but I could smell her perfume on his clothes. "Elena, we need to talk," he said, settling into his favorite chair in our living room. I looked up from the book I was reading, projecting the perfect image of a wife unprepared for devastating news. "What about, honey?" "I think we both know this marriage isn't working anymore. We've grown apart. We want different things. I think it would be better for both of us if we ended things amicably." I set down my book, letting my hands shake slightly. "Derek, what are you saying? Are you asking for a divorce?" "I think it's for the best. I've already spoken to a lawyer just to understand our options. The good news is that since we don't have children and our assets are relatively simple, the process should be straightforward." Relatively simple. He had no idea how complicated things were about to become. "I don't understand," I said, allowing tears to gather in my eyes. "Is there someone else? Are you having an affair?" Derek's expression softened and he reached for my hands. The manipulation was masterful. Comfort the victim while robbing them blind. Alina, this isn't about anyone else. This is about us, recognizing that we're not right for each other anymore. I think if we handle this maturely, we can both move on to better things. What about our house, our savings? How would we divide everything? That's where the lawyer comes in. I've had some preliminary papers drawn up, just to give us a starting point for discussions. Would you be willing to look at them? This was it. The moment Derek would present me with divorce papers identical to the ones I'd found months earlier, expecting me to sign away rights to money he didn't even know I had. I suppose I should look at them, I said, wiping away a tear. When can I see them? Actually, Derek said, reaching for his briefcase, I have them with me. I thought maybe we could go through them together. Make sure you understand everything before you decide anything. He handed me a folder containing documents that looked exactly like the ones I'd photographed from his desk drawer. Same law firm, same terms, same attempt to rob me of my financial future. The only difference was the date. These were current, ready for my real signature. I read through them carefully, letting Derek think I was struggling to understand the legal language. In reality, I was comparing every clause to the forged versions, looking for any differences Sarah's team should know about. This seems like you get most of our assets, I said. Well, Elena, most of our assets are tied to my business and investments. It makes sense for me to maintain control of those. You'll get your personal savings and the freedom to start fresh. My personal savings, the account that now contained $5 million he couldn't access. I need time to think about this, I said, and I should probably have my own lawyer look at these papers. For just a moment, Derek's mask slipped. I saw panic cross across his face before he recovered his composure. Of course, you should do whatever makes you comfortable, but Elena, I hope we can resolve this quickly. Dragging things out with lawyers and court battles won't help either of us. I understand. Give me a week to process this and talk to someone about my options. Derek nodded, clearly hoping I would be too overwhelmed or too trusting to seek serious legal advice. He had no idea I'd been working with one of the best divorce attorneys in the state for months. That night, Derek stayed late at the office again. I called Sarah immediately. He presented the papers, I told her. Perfect. Are they identical to the forged versions? Completely identical. Same terms, same attempt to steal my assets, same criminal fraud wrapped in legal paperwork. Elena, we have everything we need. The question now is how dramatic you want this to be. We can handle this quietly through the legal system, or we can make sure Derek faces the full consequences of his actions. I thought about Derek's cold confidence as he handed me papers designed to rob me of millions. I thought about his months of careful deception, his manipulation, his assumption that I was too stupid to protect myself. Sarah, I want him to face every possible consequence. Criminal charges, public exposure, complete financial ruin. I want him to understand exactly how badly he underestimated his wife. Then we'll need to coordinate with law enforcement. Financial fraud of this magnitude will interest the FBI, especially given your connection to federal research contracts. The FBI? My colleagues in the Forensic Science Division would be very interested in Derek's criminal scheme. Set up the meetings. It's time for Derek to learn who he really married. The next morning, I went to work as usual, coordinating research studies and managing participant data. But I also spent time with my contacts in the FBI's white-collar crime division, sharing Sarah's preliminary findings and offering my expertise in financial fraud investigation. Agent Morrison, whom I'd worked with on several previous cases, was fascinated by the complexity of Derek's scheme. This is textbook financial fraud, Elena.
Forgery, attempted theft, conspiracy. Your husband is looking at serious federal charges. How serious? With the amounts involved and the level of premeditation, we're talking about decades in federal prison. I felt a surge of satisfaction. Derek had spent months planning my financial destruction. Now I would spend the next few months planning his complete ruin.
For the rest of June and into July, I played my part perfectly. I met with Sarah regularly, appearing conflicted about the divorce. I asked Derek questions about the financial arrangements, seeming confused and overwhelmed by the legal complexity. I even went to a few counseling sessions with him, where he performed beautifully as the reluctant husband who just wanted what was best for both of us. Emma continued to be his shadow, though she tried to stay invisible. I began photographing her as well, documenting her involvement in Derek's criminal enterprise. Sarah's investigators discovered that Emma had helped Derek research my potential earnings from the pharmaceutical contract, using her access to his business files to estimate the timing and amounts of my payments. They had planned everything together. The affair wasn't just personal, it was professional. Emma would become Derek's new wife after he'd stolen my fortune, and they would live comfortably on money that legally belonged to me. But Derek had made one final, fatal error in his planning. He'd assumed I would sign the papers quickly, eager to escape an obviously failing marriage. When I continued to stall, asking for more time and more legal review, he became impatient. In mid-July, Derek made his final mistake. He tried to pressure me into signing by threatening to make the divorce more difficult if I didn't cooperate soon. "Elena, this generous settlement offer isn't going to stay on the table forever," he told me one evening. "If you force this into a court battle, you might end up with much less than what I'm offering now." "Are you threatening me, Derek?" "I'm just being realistic. Divorce can get ugly if both parties aren't reasonable." That conversation was recorded on the device Sarah had given me. Derek had just committed intimidation and coercion in addition to his other crimes. The following week, Sarah made her move. Derek was served with papers at his office, in front of Emma and several colleagues. But these weren't the divorce papers he was expecting. These were criminal charges filed by the federal prosecutor's office, supported by evidence gathered over 4 months of investigation. Forgery in the first degree, financial fraud, conspiracy to commit theft, attempted extortion. Each charge carried significant prison time, and together they painted a picture of a man who had systematically planned to destroy his wife financially. Within hours, Derek's business accounts were frozen pending investigation. His office was searched by federal agents who discovered communications with Emma detailing their entire scheme. Emma was arrested at her apartment that evening, caught trying to destroy evidence she thought would never be found. Derek called me that night from his lawyer's office, his voice shaking with rage and panic. "What did you do, Elena? What did you do?" I was sitting in my living room, the same room where he'd handed me forged divorce papers just weeks earlier, sipping tea and reviewing the pharmaceutical company's latest payment notification. Another $2.5 million was scheduled to arrive in my account the following week. I protected myself, Derek. I did what you never thought I was smart enough to do. "Those charges are ridiculous. I never forged anything. I never tried to steal from you. This is all a misunderstanding." "Really? Then I'm sure you won't mind when the FBI compares your signature on the original divorce papers with their handwriting analysis experts. I'm sure you won't mind when they examine your communications with Emma about my pharmaceutical contract. I'm sure they won't mind when they calculate how much money you attempted to steal through forged legal documents." Silence on the other end of the line. "Derek, are you there?" "How long have you known?" he asked finally. "I found the original papers in March. I've been building the case against you ever since." "You've been planning this for months?" "Just like you've been planning to rob me for months. The difference is that my plan actually worked." Derek's breathing was audible through the phone. "Elena, we can work this out. We can settle this privately. I'll give you everything. The house, the business, all of it. Just drop the charges." "Derek, you can't give me what's already mine, and you can't undo months of federal crimes with a settlement offer." "Please, Elena, I made a mistake. I was stupid, but I'm still your husband. Doesn't that mean anything?" I looked around the room where Derek had spent months manipulating me, lying to me, planning to destroy my financial future while pretending to love me. "You're right, Derek. You are still my husband, which makes your betrayal even worse." I hung up and blocked his number. The next morning, Derek's arrest made the local news. Local businessman charged with elaborate scheme to defraud wife, read the headline. The story outlined the basic facts of the case without mentioning the specific amounts involved, but it was enough to destroy Derek's reputation and his business. Emma was featured in a follow-up article as Derek's co-conspirator, her role in the financial fraud detailed for all her friends and family to read. The woman who thought she was going to live comfortably on my stolen money was now facing her own federal charges and social humiliation. Sarah called me that afternoon with an update. Derek's lawyer is already talking about plea bargains. They want to avoid a trial if possible. What kind of plea bargain? Full confession, restitution for investigation costs, and Derek serves at least 8 years in federal prison. Emma would serve 3 years as a cooperating witness. And if they don't take the plea? Then we go to trial with overwhelming evidence, and they're both looking at much longer sentences. The prosecutor thinks Derek could get 15 to 20 years if convicted on all charges. I considered my options. Derek in prison for 8 years would give me time to build my new life with my pharmaceutical income. Derek in prison for 15 years would destroy him completely. What do you recommend, Sarah? Honestly, let them reject the plea offer. They're guilty of everything we've accused them of, and the evidence is overwhelming. A trial would be a formality, and the longer sentences would ensure they never try anything like this again. Then let's go to trial. Derek and Emma both rejected the plea offers, apparently convinced they could somehow defend their actions in court. Derek hired an expensive defense team with money he'd borrowed against his business, money he'd lose when the business was seized as part of the restitution. The trial was scheduled for October, which gave me time to settle into my new life. I'd received 3 payments from the pharmaceutical company by then, nearly $8 million that Derek would never touch. I used some of the money to buy a beautiful house across town, far from the memories of Derek's deception. I also received a promotion at work, recognition for my expertise in financial fraud investigation. My colleagues were impressed by my role in uncovering and prosecuting Derek's crimes, and I was offered opportunities to work on more complex cases. My life had expanded in ways I'd never imagined. Without Derek's constant manipulation and control, I discovered interests and friendships I'd forgotten existed. I joined a hiking club, took cooking classes, and started planning international travel. The money from the pharmaceutical contract meant I could work because I wanted to, not because I needed to. Derek, meanwhile, was living in a small apartment, his business failing, his reputation destroyed. Emma had moved back in with her parents, her career in ruins. They'd both learned the hard way what happened when you tried to manipulate someone smarter than yourself. In September, just weeks before the trial, Derek made one last attempt to contact me. He showed up at my new house looking haggard and desperate. "Elena, please, I need to talk to you." I considered calling the police. He was violating the restraining order Sarah had obtained, but curiosity won out. I wanted to hear what he had to say. "You have 5 minutes," I told him, not inviting him inside. "I know I hurt you. I know I made terrible mistakes, but Elena, I'm going to prison for decades. My life is over. Isn't that enough punishment?" "Derek, you tried to steal $25 million from me through forged legal documents. You manipulated me for months while planning to destroy my financial future. You brought your mistress into our home and our bed while plotting against me. What punishment would be appropriate for that level of betrayal? I thought you'd never know. I thought the money would just disappear into our joint assets after the divorce, and you'd be fine with your settlement. You thought I was too stupid to notice you were robbing me." Derek's shoulders slumped. "Yes, I thought you were too trusting, too naive. I thought your job was just busy work, and you'd never understand what I was doing. And now I know I married someone much smarter than I ever realized, someone capable of destroying me completely when I crossed her. Derek, I didn't destroy you. You destroyed yourself with your own greed and arrogance. I just made sure you faced the consequences." He nodded, accepting the truth finally. "For what it's worth, Elena, I am sorry, not just because I got caught, but because I hurt someone who never deserved it." I looked at the man I'd been married to for 12 years, the man who'd planned my financial ruin while pretending to love me. I felt nothing for him now. No anger, no sadness, no regret. Just indifference. Derek, your apology doesn't change anything. You made your choices, and now you'll live with the consequences. That's how justice works. He walked back to his car without another word. I never saw him again. The trial began in October and lasted 3 weeks. Derek and Emma's defense team tried to argue that the divorce papers were a misunderstanding, that Derek had been confused about the legal process and never intended to defraud anyone. The prosecutors demolished these arguments with mountains of evidence: communications between Derek and Emma discussing their plans, financial records showing Derek's research into my pharmaceutical contract, handwriting analysis confirming the forgery. My testimony was the highlight of the trial. I explained how I discovered the forged papers, how I'd built the investigation case, and how Derek continued trying to manipulate me even after being caught. The jury was fascinated by the complexity of Derek's scheme and appalled by his months of deception. Derek took the stand in his own defense, a decision his lawyers clearly regretted. Under cross-examination, he admitted to forging my signature, admitted to planning the financial fraud, and admitted to manipulating me throughout our marriage. His testimony destroyed any remaining sympathy the jury might have had for him. Emma's testimony was even worse for their case. She tried to portray herself as Derek's victim, claiming he'd manipulated her into helping with his scheme. But the prosecution showed how Emma had actively participated in the scheme and even suggested ways to make the fraud more effective.
But the prosecutors had recordings of her discussing the plan with obvious enthusiasm, evidence of her researching by financial contracts, and proof that she'd been equally involved in planning my destruction. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty on all charges for both defendants. Derek was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison. Emma received 12 years. Both were ordered to pay restitution for the investigation costs and were banned from any contact with me for the rest of their lives. I sat in the courtroom listening to the sentences, feeling a deep satisfaction I'd never experienced before. Derek had tried to steal my future, and instead, he'd lost his own. Emma had thought she was gaining a wealthy husband, and instead, she'd gained a federal prison sentence. After the trial, Sarah and I went to dinner to celebrate. "How does it feel?" she asked. "Like justice," I said. Derek spent months planning to destroy my life financially, and he ended up destroying his own life completely. "Any regrets about how you handled it?" I thought about that question seriously. Could I have handled Derek's betrayal differently? Could I have confronted him earlier, maybe saved our marriage somehow? "No regrets," I said finally. Derek made his choices when he forged my signature on those divorce papers. Everything that happened after that was just consequences. Sarah raised her glass. "To Elena Rodriguez, the woman who turned the tables on financial fraud." To Elena Rodriguez, the woman who discovered she was much stronger than anyone ever imagined. 6 months later, I received my final payment from the pharmaceutical company, $25 million over 10 years, just as promised. Derek had tried to steal this money through forged documents and elaborate schemes. Instead, every penny went to building my new life, funding my charitable foundation, and supporting the research that had made the payments possible in the first place. I never remarried. I didn't need a partner to feel complete or secure. My work continued to be fulfilling, my friendships grew deeper, and my life expanded in directions I'd never explored while married to Derek. Sometimes people ask me if I ever think about what might have happened if Derek had simply been honest about his financial struggles, if he'd asked for help instead of trying to steal from me. The truth is, Derek was never in financial trouble. His business was successful, our marriage was stable financially. His scheme wasn't born from desperation. It was born from pure greed and the arrogant assumption that he could manipulate me without consequences. Derek learned in federal prison that underestimating people can be the most expensive mistake you'll ever make. Emma learned that choosing the wrong partner in crime can cost you your entire future. And I learned that sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's simply letting people face the natural consequences of their own actions. The divorce papers Derek had forged were never filed. The marriage ended not through his careful manipulation, but through his criminal conviction and incarceration.
In a way, Derek got exactly what he'd planned. Our marriage was over, and our assets were completely separated. He just wasn't the one who ended up with the money. The morning after Derek's sentencing, I woke up in my new house to silence. Not the oppressive silence of a troubled marriage, but the peaceful quiet of a life finally my own. Sunlight streamed through windows I'd chosen, in a bedroom decorated with colors I loved, in a home purchased with money Derek had tried to steal. The irony wasn't lost on me. My phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Morrison at the pharmaceutical company. The research based on my genetic markers had yielded breakthrough results faster than anyone anticipated. 3 new medications were entering clinical trials, and the preliminary data suggested they could help millions of patients worldwide. My DNA wasn't just making me wealthy, it was potentially saving lives. That realization shifted something fundamental in how I viewed the entire ordeal with Derek. His attempted theft hadn't just been about stealing money from me personally. He tried to steal resources that could fund medical research, support charitable causes, and contribute to scientific advancement. His greed could have delayed treatments for people desperately needing help. I made coffee and settled at my kitchen table with my laptop, something I'd rarely had time to do during my marriage. Derek had always demanded breakfast at exactly 7:30, insisted I iron his shirts before work, expected me to manage every household detail while maintaining my demanding career. Now, my mornings were my own, and I used them to plan how to make the most impact with my unexpected fortune. The pharmaceutical payments were structured to continue for 7 more years, but I'd already received enough to live comfortably forever. The question was how to use this opportunity meaningfully. I'd started a foundation during Derek's trial, initially as a way to demonstrate to the court that I intended to use the contested money for legitimate purposes. Now the foundation had become my passion project. The Rodriguez Foundation for Medical Research focused on funding studies that larger pharmaceutical companies often ignored: rare diseases, treatments for underserved populations, research into conditions that affected women disproportionately. I had learned during my years coordinating research studies that many important medical questions went unanswered simply because they weren't profitable enough for major corporations to pursue. My first major grant was already showing results. A small research team in Denver had been studying a rare genetic condition that caused severe pain in young children. Traditional funding sources had rejected their proposals repeatedly because the condition affected fewer than 10,000 people worldwide. My foundation provided them with $2 million over 3 years, and they'd already identified a potential treatment pathway. The personal satisfaction of funding meaningful research was incredible. But there was another aspect of my new life that surprised me even more. Without Derek's constant criticism and control, I'd rediscovered parts of myself I'd forgotten existed. I was funny, I realized, something Derek had never appreciated. I was adventurous, something he'd actively discouraged. I was intellectually curious about topics far beyond my professional specialization, something he'd dismissed as impractical. My social circle had expanded dramatically. During my marriage, Derek had gradually isolated me from friends he deemed inappropriate or not ambitious enough. He'd criticized my college friends as still acting like children, my work colleagues as boring academics, and my family as not sophisticated enough for our lifestyle. Slowly, I'd stopped making plans with people Derek disapproved of until my social world consisted entirely of his business associates and their wives. Now I was reconnecting with friends I'd lost touch with years ago. Sarah Chen had introduced me to her book club, a group of accomplished women who met monthly to discuss everything from literary fiction to political biographies. I joined the hiking group and discovered I love challenging myself physically in ways Derek had never supported. I'd even started taking art classes, something I'd wanted to do since college, but Derek had considered a waste of time. The most surprising reconnection was with my sister Carmen, who lived across the country in Boston. Carmen and Derek had never gotten along, and he'd made it clear that her visits were unwelcome in our home. During our marriage, Carmen and I had grown distant, communicating mainly through brief holiday phone calls and occasional texts. After Derek's arrest, Carmen had called immediately.
"Are you okay? Do you need me to come out there?" That conversation had lasted 4 hours. We talked about everything Derek had done, but also about how much we'd missed each other.
how his manipulation had affected my relationship with my entire family. Carmen was a successful software engineer who'd always been incredibly supportive of my career, but Derek had somehow convinced me that she was jealous of our lifestyle. "Elena, I never understood what you saw in that man," Carmen said. "Every time I visited, he treated you like his personal assistant rather than his wife. And the way he talked about your work, like it was some kind of hobby instead of a serious profession." I know that now. I'm not sure how I convinced myself it was normal for so long. Manipulation is insidious. It happens gradually, so you don't notice how much of yourself you're losing until someone gives you permission to find it again. Carmen was planning to visit for Thanksgiving, our first holiday together in almost 5 years. I was looking forward to it more than I'd anticipated any social event in years. My professional life had also transformed in unexpected ways. The publicity from Derek's trial had brought attention to my work in forensic science and financial fraud investigation. I'd received offers to consult on several high-profile cases, and the FBI had approached me about leading a new task force focused on domestic financial crimes. Agent Morrison had been particularly encouraging. "Elena, what you accomplished with your personal case was extraordinary investigative work. The documentation, the patience, the strategic thinking, those are exactly the skills we need for complex white-collar crime cases." I was considering the FBI position seriously. The salary was comparable to what I earned at the university, but the work would be more varied and potentially more impactful. I'd also be working with a team of people who understood the complexities of financial manipulation and the damage it could cause to victims. The decision became easier when I learned about the specific cases the task force was handling. They were investigating a network of financial advisors who were systematically defrauding elderly clients, stealing retirement savings through forged documents, and manipulated investment accounts. The victims were losing their life savings to criminals who exploited their trust and their occasional confusion about complex financial instruments. It sounded remarkably similar to what Derek had tried to do to me, except these criminals were targeting vulnerable populations who had fewer resources to fight back. I could use my experience and my financial security to help people who couldn't protect themselves the way I'd been able to protect myself. I accepted the FBI position in November, 2 months after Derek's sentencing. My first case involved a financial advisor in Sacramento who had stolen over $3 million from 12 elderly clients. The case was complex because the advisor had been careful to make his thefts look like legitimate investment losses, and several of his victims were showing early signs of dementia that made their testimony potentially unreliable. Working with the FBI team reminded me why I'd been so successful at investigating Derek's crimes. I approached financial fraud cases with the methodical precision of scientific research, documenting every detail and building comprehensive timelines that prosecutors could present clearly to juries. My background in medical research also helped me understand the psychological aspects of financial manipulation, particularly when criminals targeted vulnerable populations. The Sacramento case took 6 months to build, but the results were gratifying. The advisor was convicted on 14 counts of financial fraud and sentenced to 22 years in federal prison. More importantly, we recovered almost all of the stolen money and returned it to his victims. Several of the elderly clients cried when they received their restitution checks, money they'd assumed was lost forever. During the same period, Derek was adjusting to life in federal prison. I didn't communicate with him directly, but Sarah occasionally updated me on information she received through legal channels. Derek had been assigned to a minimum security facility in Nevada, where he was working in the prison library and apparently taking correspondence courses in business ethics. The irony of Derek studying business ethics wasn't lost on me, but I was glad he was using his time constructively. Emma, meanwhile, was serving her sentence at a women's facility in Arizona. According to Sarah's information, she was working in the prison's computer lab and had enrolled in a paralegal training program. I felt no satisfaction in their imprisonment, but I also felt no sympathy for their circumstances. They'd made conscious choices to commit serious crimes, and they were facing the consequences of those choices. My focus was on building my new life and using my resources to help prevent other people from becoming victims of similar crimes. The one aspect of Derek's imprisonment that did affect me was the public attention it had generated. The local media had covered the trial extensively, and the story of the wife who'd outsmarted her husband's elaborate financial fraud had attracted national interest. I'd been interviewed by several news programs and featured in a magazine article about domestic financial abuse. The publicity was generally positive, but it also meant I couldn't completely escape my connection to Derek's crimes. People recognized me at work, in restaurants, at social events. Most were supportive and curious about my experience, but some seemed to think I'd been vindictive or excessive in pursuing criminal charges. "Couldn't you have just divorced him and moved on?" asked a colleague during a university faculty meeting. "Did he really deserve 18 years in prison?" I'd learned to address these questions directly. Derek forged legal documents to steal $25 million from me. That's a federal crime with serious consequences. The prison sentence reflects the severity of what he attempted to do. "But he was your husband. Doesn't that change things?" Actually, it makes things worse. Derek had access to my personal information, my financial records, my trust. He used that access to commit crimes against me. The fact that we were married makes his actions more serious, not less serious. Most people understood once I explained the full scope of Derek's scheme. The few who continued to suggest I'd been too harsh usually revealed their own assumptions about marriage and money that made their opinions irrelevant to me. The most meaningful response came from other women who'd experienced financial manipulation in their own relationships. After the magazine article was published, I received dozens of letters from readers sharing their own stories. Many had endured similar betrayals, but hadn't known how to protect themselves or seek justice. One letter particularly moved me. A woman in Florida wrote about discovering that her husband had been stealing from her small business for over 2 years, using the money to fund an affair and a secret gambling addiction. She'd felt helpless to fight back because all their assets were intermingled and she couldn't afford legal representation. I sent her information about legal aid organizations and connected her with Sarah Chen, who agreed to consult on the case pro bono. 6 months later, she wrote again to thank me. She'd not only recovered her stolen money, but had also successfully divorced her husband and rebuilt her business. These connections led to an unexpected opportunity. A publisher approached me to write a book on financial fraud in domestic relationships, focusing on how people could protect themselves from manipulation by trusted partners. The advance they offered was substantial, but more importantly, the book could help people recognize warning signs and take protective action before becoming victims. I spent evenings and weekends working on the manuscript, drawing on my experience with Derek, but also incorporating research on broader patterns of domestic financial abuse. The book included practical advice on documenting financial irregularities, working with attorneys and law enforcement, and rebuilding after financial betrayal. Writing about Derek's manipulation forced me to examine aspects of our relationship I'd been avoiding. In the immediate aftermath of his arrest, I'd focused on the criminal aspects of his behavior, the forgery, the conspiracy, the attempted theft. But the book required me to analyze the emotional and psychological tactics he had used to maintain control over me for years.
Derek had been masterful at making me doubt my own perceptions. When I questioned financial decisions, he'd explain them in ways that made me feel foolish for asking. When I suggested different approaches to problems, he'd dismiss my ideas as impractical or naive. When I expressed interest in activities or friendships he didn't approve of, he'd find ways to make those pursuits seem selfish or inappropriate. The cumulative effect had been to make me increasingly dependent on his judgment and increasingly disconnected from my own instincts. By the time he started planning his financial fraud, I'd been conditioned to accept his explanations without questioning them too deeply. Understanding these patterns helped me recognize how many women might be vulnerable to similar manipulation. Financial abuse often began with subtle control tactics that gradually escalated over time. Partners who isolated their victims socially, who insisted on controlling all financial decisions, who dismissed their partner's professional accomplishments. These were warning signs that could predict more serious exploitation later. The book also explored how people could rebuild their lives after financial betrayal. My experience with Derek had taught me that recovery wasn't just about getting money back or seeing justice done. It was also about rediscovering your own capabilities, reconnecting with people who valued you, and learning to trust your own judgment again. By the time I finished the manuscript in the spring, almost 2 years after Derek's arrest, my life had stabilized into patterns that felt completely natural. My work with the FBI was challenging and meaningful. My foundation was funding important research projects and making a real difference in people's lives. My personal relationships were deeper and more authentic than they'd been in years. I'd also started dating, something I'd been nervous about initially. How do you explain to someone new that your previous husband is in federal prison for trying to rob you? How do you trust someone with your financial information when your last partner had used that information to commit crimes? The man I was seeing, Dr. James Chen, was Sarah's cousin and a research physician at Oregon Health Sciences University. Sarah had introduced us at a dinner party, mentioning casually that we both worked in medical research and might have professional interests in common. James knew about Derek in the criminal case, but he was more interested in my current work than my past traumas. He appreciated my professional accomplishments, supported my foundation work, and never made me feel like I needed to justify my financial independence or my career priorities. Our relationship developed slowly and naturally. James had his own demanding career and his own social circle, so we saw each other regularly but weren't constantly together. He encouraged my work with the FBI and was genuinely interested in the cases I was handling. When I mentioned considering a promotion that would require some travel, he was enthusiastic rather than controlling. The contrast with Derek was striking. Where Derek had been possessive and manipulative, James was supportive and respectful. Where Derek had diminished my accomplishments, James celebrated them. Where Derek had isolated me from other people, James encouraged my friendships and professional relationships. I wasn't ready for marriage or any kind of permanent commitment, but I was enjoying the relationship and learning to trust someone new. James understood my caution and never pressured me to move faster than felt comfortable. The second anniversary of Derek's arrest passed quietly. I marked the date by reviewing my foundation's annual report, which showed that we'd funded 12 research projects and distributed over $8 million in grants. The research we'd supported had led to 2 promising new treatments and several published studies that were advancing scientific understanding of rare diseases. I also received an update from the FBI about Derek's status in prison. He'd completed his business ethics courses and was now tutoring other inmates in financial literacy. His behavior had been exemplary, and he'd be eligible for early parole consideration in 12 years rather than 18. Part of me was glad Derek was using his time in prison constructively. The man who'd tried to steal my future was apparently learning to help other people manage their finances honestly. Whether his transformation was genuine or simply strategic didn't matter to me anymore. Derek was no longer my problem to solve or my responsibility to judge. Emma's situation was more complicated. She'd been released early for good behavior and cooperation with authorities, but she was struggling to rebuild her life. Her criminal record made it difficult to find employment in her field, and her family relationships had been damaged by the scandal. She'd reached out through intermediaries several times, asking if I'd be willing to meet with her. I declined those requests. Emma had made her own choices when she decided to help Derek commit crimes against me. I wished her well in rebuilding her life, but I had no interest in providing her with absolution or assistance. Some consequences couldn't be undone through apologies or rehabilitation. My focus remained on the future rather than the past. The FBI task force was expanding, and I'd been offered a leadership position that would allow me to shape national policy on domestic financial crimes. The book was scheduled for publication in 6 months, with a publicity tour that could help raise awareness about financial abuse in relationships. Most importantly, I'd learned to value myself in ways I never had during my marriage to Derek. I discovered that I was capable of protecting myself, of building a meaningful career, of maintaining authentic relationships, and of using resources responsibly to help other people. Derek had tried to steal my money, but inadvertently, he'd given me something much more valuable. He'd forced me to discover my own strength, my own intelligence, and my own capacity for strategic thinking. The woman who'd found those forged divorce papers was naive enough to trust a manipulative husband. The woman I'd become could recognize deception, document crimes, and ensure justice was served. The pharmaceutical company's payments continued arriving quarterly, now totaling over $15 million. Each payment reminded me of how much Derek had tried to steal and how completely his plan had backfired. Instead of robbing me of my financial future, his crimes had motivated me to use that future more purposefully than I might have otherwise. I was considering expanding the foundation's scope to include funding for legal aid organizations that helped victims of domestic financial abuse. My experience with Derek had shown me how important it was for people to have access to competent legal representation when fighting financial manipulation. Many victims couldn't afford the kind of attorney I'd been able to hire, and that disparity in resources often determined whether justice was achieved. The legal aid funding would be a fitting legacy for Derek's attempted crime. Money he'd tried to steal would be used to help other victims fight back against similar manipulation. The resources he'd coveted would be deployed to prevent other people from experiencing the betrayal I'd endured. As I planned these new initiatives, I'd often reflect on the strange turns my life had taken. 2 years ago, I'd been a woman trapped in a manipulative marriage, unaware that my husband was planning to rob me of millions of dollars. Now, I was a successful FBI agent, a published author, a foundation director, and a person who had learned to trust her own judgment completely. Derek's scheme was elaborate, carefully planned, and expertly executed. He anticipated every aspect of his crime except one crucial detail. He underestimated his victim. That single miscalculation had transformed what should have been a successful financial fraud into a complete disaster for everyone involved in planning it. The lesson wasn't just about the importance of understanding the people you're trying to manipulate. It was about the danger of assumptions based on stereotypes, prejudices, or limited information. Derek had seen me as a naive woman who wouldn't understand complex financial matters. He was catastrophically wrong about who I was and what I was capable of achieving. Now, as I worked on cases involving other victims of financial fraud, I tried to help them recognize their own capabilities and their own options for fighting back. Many people who'd been financially manipulated felt helpless and ashamed, convinced they were too trusting or too stupid to protect themselves. My job was to help them understand that being victimized by someone you trusted wasn't a sign of weakness or stupidity. It was a sign that you'd been targeted by a criminal who'd exploited your normal human capacity for trust. The victims who recovered most successfully were those who learned to view their experiences as Derek's crimes rather than their own failures. Once they understood that they'd been targeted by criminals rather than made mistakes themselves, they could begin to rebuild their confidence and take action to protect their futures.
Derek's case had taught me that financial fraud in domestic relationships was often about much more than money. It was about power, control, and the manipulation of trust and intimacy. Understanding these deeper motivations was crucial for both preventing such crimes and helping victims recover from them. As I continued building my new life, I remained grateful for the painful lesson Derek had taught me about the importance of trusting my own perceptions and protecting my own interests. His betrayal had been devastating at the time, but it had ultimately led me to discover strengths and capabilities I never would have developed otherwise. The woman Derek had tried to manipulate no longer existed. In her place was someone who understood her own worth, who could recognize deception, who had the resources and knowledge to fight back against manipulation, and who was using those abilities to help other people protect themselves. Derek would spend many more years in prison, but I would spend those same years building something positive from the wreckage of his crimes. That seemed like the most appropriate response to his betrayal. Not revenge, but transformation. Not destruction, but reconstruction. 5 years had passed since I discovered those forged divorce papers in Derek's desk, and my life bore no resemblance to the existence I had known during our marriage.
I was standing in the conference room of the FBI's Seattle field office, looking out at Elliott Bay while reviewing case files for what would become the largest domestic financial fraud investigation in the Bureau's history. Agent Patricia Williams had called me that morning with details that made my stomach turn. A network of financial advisors across 7 states had been systematically targeting military families, particularly those dealing with deployment-related stress and financial uncertainty. The scope of the fraud was staggering. Over $40 million stolen from families who'd served their country, money that should have secured their children's education and their own retirement. The parallels to Derek's attempted theft were unmistakable, but the scale was far beyond anything I'd encountered in my previous cases. These criminals weren't just stealing from their victims, they were destroying the financial security of people who'd already sacrificed enormously for their country. Military families often had complex financial needs due to frequent relocations, deployment schedules, and unique benefit structures. The criminals had exploited this complexity to hide their thefts behind legitimate-looking investment accounts and retirement planning services. My role as director of the FBI's Domestic Financial Crimes Unit had prepared me for complex investigations, but this case would require coordination between multiple federal agencies, state prosecutors, and military justice systems. The criminals had been sophisticated enough to structure their operations across state lines and had used military-specific financial products to make their fraud harder to detect. As I studied the preliminary evidence, I couldn't help thinking about how different my life would have been if Derek's scheme had succeeded. I would never have discovered my capacity for this kind of work, never have developed the expertise that was now being deployed to help dozens of military families recover their stolen futures. The pharmaceutical company had made its final payment to me the previous month, completing the 10-year contract that had started this entire ordeal. $25 million total, exactly as promised, all of it now being used for research funding, victim advocacy, and the kind of work Derek had never imagined I was capable of doing. My book about domestic financial fraud had become a bestseller, leading to speaking engagements at law enforcement conferences, victim advocacy groups, and financial literacy seminars. The book had helped countless people recognize warning signs of financial manipulation in their own relationships, and had provided practical guidance for protecting themselves from similar crimes. More importantly, the book's success had connected me with other survivors of financial abuse who'd gone on to build meaningful lives after their betrayals. We'd formed an informal network that provided support, resources, and advocacy for new victims. Many of these women had become close friends, and several had joined me in working on high-profile fraud cases as consultants or expert witnesses. The Rodriguez Foundation had grown far beyond my initial vision. We were now funding medical research at 12 universities, providing legal aid to victims of domestic financial crimes, and supporting financial literacy programs in underserved communities. The foundation's annual budget exceeded $8 million, and we'd been recognized by several national organizations for our innovative approach to combining medical research with social justice advocacy. But the most significant change in my life wasn't professional or financial. James and I had married 2 years earlier in a small ceremony attended by close friends and family. The wedding had been everything my marriage to Derek hadn't been: honest, joyful, and based on mutual respect and genuine partnership. James had proposed after I had finished a particularly difficult case involving an elderly woman who'd been financially exploited by her own son. I'd come home exhausted and emotionally drained, and James had listened patiently while I processed the frustration of seeing someone's trust betrayed by a family member. "Elena," he'd said, "I want to spend the rest of my life supporting you in this work. I want to be the person you come home to after difficult cases. I want to celebrate your victories and help you through the challenges. Will you marry me?" It was the perfect proposal from someone who understood that my work wasn't just a career, but a calling that had emerged from my own experience with betrayal and recovery. James had never tried to compete with my professional commitments or make me choose between personal happiness and meaningful work. Our marriage was partnership in the truest sense.
We maintained separate financial accounts by mutual agreement, not because we didn't trust each other, but because we'd both learned to value financial independence. We supported each other's career goals without sacrificing our own ambitions. We built a life together that enhanced rather than diminished who we were as individuals. The contrast with Derek was so complete that sometimes I wondered how I'd ever accepted his controlling behavior as normal. James celebrated my successes, encouraged my professional growth, and never made me feel like I had to justify my choices or seek his permission for major decisions. When the FBI offered me a promotion that would require occasional travel to Washington, D.C., James was enthusiastic about the opportunity it represented for advancing my career. Derek's manipulation had been so gradual and so psychologically sophisticated that I hadn't recognized it until I was free from it. James's respect and support felt revolutionary by comparison, though I understood intellectually that it was simply how healthy relationships functioned. Carmen had visited frequently over the years, and James and her had developed a genuine friendship based on their shared appreciation for my work and their mutual commitment to supporting my goals. Carmen often joked that she'd finally gotten the brother-in-law she'd always wanted, someone who recognized her sister's worth instead of trying to diminish it. My relationship with my parents had also recovered from the damage Derek's manipulation had caused. During our marriage, Derek had gradually convinced me that my parents' modest lifestyle and traditional values were embarrassing obstacles to our social advancement. He'd made me feel ashamed of their working-class backgrounds and their simple pleasures, suggesting that successful people like us should distance ourselves from such influences. Now I realize that my parents' marriage was actually a model of mutual respect and partnership that Derek's relationship with me had never approached. They'd been married for 43 years, and they still consulted each other on important decisions, supported each other's interests, and treated each other as equals. Derek had trained me to see their relationship as unsophisticated, when in reality it was much healthier than anything I had experienced during my marriage to him. My parents were incredibly proud of what I had accomplished professionally, but they were more pleased that I'd found happiness in my personal life. Elena, my mother had said during their last visit, "You look like yourself again. For years, you seemed like you were trying to be someone else." That observation had struck me deeply. Derek's manipulation hadn't just involved financial control or social isolation. He'd systematically undermined my sense of who I was and what I valued, replacing my authentic self with a version that served his purposes better. Recovery hadn't just meant regaining my financial security or achieving professional success. It had meant rediscovering the person I'd been before Derek's influence had distorted my self-perception. The military financial fraud case was consuming most of my attention as we approached the coordinated arrests scheduled for the following week. 7 financial advisors in 5 states had been stealing from military families for over 3 years, using sophisticated software to manipulate investment reports and hide their thefts behind fake market losses. The lead criminal, Michael Torres, bore an uncomfortable resemblance to Derek in his methods and motivations. Torres had specifically targeted military wives whose husbands were deployed overseas, knowing that the stress of separation and the complexity of military benefits would make his victims less likely to scrutinize their financial statements carefully. He'd been stealing an average of $50,000 per family, amounts large enough to devastate their family's financial futures, but small enough to avoid immediate detection. He'd been particularly cruel in his selection of targets, focusing on families with young children who were already struggling with the emotional and financial challenges of military life. The investigation had taken 18 months to complete, requiring cooperation between multiple federal agencies, state prosecutors, and military justice systems. The criminals had been sophisticated enough to structure their operations across state lines.
He explained everything in ways that made sense, and I thought I was being responsible by working with him to plan our financial future. "Lisa," I'd replied, "you weren't stupid. You were targeted by a criminal who specialized in exploiting military families. His professional appearance and his knowledge of military benefits weren't signs that he was trustworthy. They were tools he used to commit crimes more effectively." Those conversations had reinforced my understanding of how financial predators operated. They didn't target people who were careless or naive. They targeted people who were responsible, who wanted to make smart financial decisions, who were willing to trust professionals with expertise they didn't have themselves. The victims' desire to be financially responsible had been weaponized against them by criminals who understood how to exploit trust and authority. The day of the coordinated arrests, I was in the FBI's command center monitoring operations in 5 states simultaneously. Torres was arrested at his office in Colorado Springs, where agents found him in the middle of destroying evidence on his computer. His accomplices were taken into custody at their homes and offices, most of them showing the same shock and panic I'd seen in Derek when he'd been arrested. The media coverage was extensive, focusing on the scale of the fraud and its impact on military families. I was interviewed by several news programs explaining how these criminals had operated and what families could do to protect themselves from similar schemes. The interviews felt different from the media attention I'd received after Derek's case. Then, I'd been a victim who'd fought back successfully. Now, I was a law enforcement professional who was helping other victims achieve justice. The evolution felt significant to me personally, marking how completely I'd transformed the trauma of Derek's betrayal into meaningful work that helped other people. During one interview, the reporter asked me if I had ever communicated with Derek during his imprisonment. I explained that I'd made a conscious decision not to maintain contact with him, focusing instead on building my new life and using my experience to help others. "Do you ever wonder what he thinks about what you've accomplished since his arrest?" the reporter asked. I considered the question carefully. I think Derek probably understands now that he underestimated me completely. But his opinion of my accomplishments isn't something I think about anymore. I'm not living my life to prove anything to him or to anyone else. I'm living it to make the most positive impact I can with the opportunities I've been given. That response captured something important about how my relationship to Derek's betrayal had evolved. In the immediate aftermath of his arrest, my actions had been motivated partly by anger and a desire to ensure he faced consequences for his crimes. Over time, that motivation had shifted toward using my experience and resources to prevent other people from enduring similar betrayals. Derek's attempted theft had given me an education in financial fraud that had become the foundation for meaningful work helping other victims. His manipulation had taught me to recognize psychological control tactics that I now helped others identify and resist. His betrayal had motivated me to build financial security and independence that I was using to fund important research and advocacy work. In a strange way, Derek had inadvertently created the person he'd always claimed I wasn't, someone capable of sophisticated strategic thinking, someone who could outmaneuver criminals, someone whose work had national impact and recognition. His crimes had revealed capacities I might never have discovered otherwise. The military fraud case concluded with guilty pleas from all 7 defendants. Torres received a 23-year sentence, longer than Derek's because his crimes had targeted military families and involved a larger criminal network. His accomplices received sentences ranging from 8 to 15 years, and all were ordered to pay full restitution to their victims. More importantly, we recovered over $35 million of the $40 million that had been stolen, money that could be returned to the families who'd been victimized. Lisa Martinez received a check for the full amount that had been stolen from her daughter's college fund, along with interest and penalties that Torres was required to pay. The success of the military fraud investigation led to my appointment as the FBI's National Coordinator for Domestic Financial Crimes, a position that would involve developing training programs for local law enforcement and creating national databases to track financial predators who operated across state lines. The promotion came with a significant increase in responsibility and resources, but also with the satisfaction of knowing that my personal experience with Derek's crimes was being transformed into systemic changes that could protect thousands of people from similar victimization. James was characteristically supportive of the promotion, even though it would require us to relocate to Washington, D.C. "Elena, this is exactly the kind of work you were meant to do. I'm proud of you for turning something so personally devastating into something that helps so many other people." We began planning our move to D.C., where James had accepted a position with the National Institutes of Health that would allow him to continue his medical research while I took on my new responsibilities with the FBI. The transition felt like the final step in rebuilding my life after Derek's betrayal. moving from victim to survivor to advocate to national leader in combating the crimes that had once threatened to destroy my own future. On our last evening in Portland, I drove by the house where Derek and I had lived during our marriage. It had been sold years earlier as part of the asset forfeiture process, and the new owners had painted it a cheerful yellow that made it look nothing like the place where I'd discovered those forged divorce papers. I felt no nostalgia looking at the house, but I did feel a deep sense of gratitude for the journey that had begun there. Derek's attempted theft had set in motion a series of events that had led me to discover who I truly was and what I was truly capable of achieving. Derek had planned to steal $25 million from me. Instead, his crimes had motivated me to use that money in ways that would have a lasting, positive impact on the world. The woman who found those divorce papers 5 years earlier had been naive enough to trust a manipulative husband. The woman I had become was leading national efforts to protect other people from similar manipulation. The transformation had been painful, but it had also been the most meaningful experience of my life. Derek's plan had failed completely, but in failing, it had created something far more valuable than anything he'd ever imagined stealing. His attempted theft had generated justice, protection for other victims, medical research funding, and a career devoted to preventing the crimes he'd tried to commit. In the end, Derek had given me the greatest gift possible. He'd forced me to discover my own strength, my own intelligence, and my capacity to transform personal betrayal into meaningful work that helped other people. I was grateful for that discovery, even though I would never be grateful to the man whose crimes had made it necessary.